The empath sits across from their therapist, explaining why they cut off their entire family. And they're not crying. That's what disturbs everyone. The therapist asks how they feel about the decision. The empath pauses, considers it honestly, and says, clear. Not angry, not grieving, not defensive, just clear. And the therapist writes something in their notes because this level of calm certainty in someone who used to dissolve into tears over a stranger's bad day doesn't fit any model they were trained in. Carl Jung spent decades studying people who went through this exact transformation. What he found disturbed him deeply, not because these individuals were becoming cold or damaged, but because what they were becoming didn't match anything the psychological community had language for. They weren't healing in the way healing is supposed to look. They were becoming something else entirely. Something that made the people around them deeply uncomfortable while making the empath, for the first time in their life, genuinely whole. Today I'm going to show you what an awakened empath actually becomes according to Jung's observations, why this transformation looks nothing like what the spiritual marketplace promises, and why the person who emerges on the other side of empathic awakening is so psychologically different from who they were before that most people won't recognize them, including themselves. To understand what the awakened empath becomes, you first have to understand what they were before. And Jung didn't romanticize this. He looked at unawakened empaths and saw something most people refuse to acknowledge. He saw individuals whose extraordinary sensitivity wasn't a gift they'd been blessed with. It was an adaptation they'd been forced to develop. A survival mechanism forged in environments where reading other people's emotional states wasn't optional. It was the difference between safety and catastrophe. The child who could sense their parents' mood shift before a single word was spoken. The teenager who absorbed the household's anxiety because someone had to carry it, or the whole system would collapse. The adult who walked into rooms and immediately knew who was hurting, who was lying, who was about to break. These people didn't develop empathy through spiritual evolution. They developed it through necessity. Their nervous systems learned to monitor everyone else's internal states because failing to do so had consequences. Jung called this the wounded healer archetype, and he was blunt about its origins. The empath's sensitivity wasn't evidence of spiritual advancement. It was evidence of a childhood where their own emotional needs were so consistently neglected that they redirected all their perceptual energy outward. They became experts at reading everyone else because no one was reading them. They became masters of emotional labor because the alternative was abandonment. Their gift, as the world called it, was actually a scar dressed up as a superpower. And this is where the spiritual marketplace makes its most profitable lie. It tells empaths that their sensitivity is a divine blessing, that they're old souls, light workers, chosen ones, that their ability to feel everything means they're more evolved than the people who don't. This narrative feels wonderful to someone who spent their entire life feeling broken. Finally, an explanation that makes the pain feel meaningful. But Jung would tell you that this narrative is the most dangerous thing an empath can believe because it prevents them from doing the one thing that could actually transform them. It prevents them from questioning the wound itself. The awakened empath doesn't begin their transformation by embracing their sensitivity. They begin by interrogating it. They start asking questions that the spiritual community finds threatening. Why do I feel responsible for everyone's emotions? What happened to me that made me believe my worth was determined by how much I could absorb from others? When did I learn that my own needs were less important than everyone else's comfort? These questions aren't spiritual, they're psychological, and they lead somewhere the empathy as gift narrative cannot follow. Jung observed that genuine empathic awakening always started with a period of disillusionment so severe it resembled depression. The empath would begin to see their relationships clearly, sometimes for the first time, and what they saw was devastating, not because the people around them were all terrible, but because the dynamics they'd participated in for years were built on a foundation of self-abandonment so complete that there was almost nothing authentic left in the structure. They'd realized they'd been performing a role, the available one, the understanding one, the one who never has needs, the one who forgives everything, the one who explains away other people's cruelty as pain they haven't healed yet. And they'd realized this performance wasn't love, it wasn't compassion, it wasn't spiritual maturity, it was a trauma response so deeply embedded they'd mistaken it for their personality. This recognition is where most empaths stop, because what comes next is unbearable for someone whose entire identity was built around being needed. What comes next is the death of the helper, and Jung documented this death with the precision of someone who understood that psychological transformation always requires something to die first. The helper dies when the empath finally accepts a truth they've been running from their entire life. They cannot heal anyone, not through their sensitivity, not through their understanding, not through their willingness to absorb other people's darkness. All those years of carrying other people's pain didn't transform that pain. It just relocated it into the empath's body, into their nervous system, into their chronic exhaustion and mysterious illnesses and the depression they couldn't explain because their life looked fine from the outside. Jung called this shadow integration, and for empaths, it specifically meant integrating the shadow of their compassion, because compassion has a shadow. The shadow of always helping is the need to be needed. The shadow of constant forgiveness is the inability to hold others accountable. The shadow of absorbing everyone's pain is the avoidance of facing your own. And until the empath confronts these shadows, their sensitivity remains a cage, not a gift. What happens when the helper dies? This is where Jung's observations become genuinely uncomfortable. Because the person who emerges doesn't look like what anyone expects. They don't become a more evolved, more compassionate, more radiant version of the old empath. They become something the old empath would have been terrified of. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. The first thing the awakened empath becomes is selective, not occasionally selective, ruthlessly selective, about who gets their energy, their time, their emotional presence. The old empath was available to everyone. The awakened empath is available to almost no one. And this isn't bitterness or walls or avoidance. It's the natural result of someone who finally understands what their energy is worth and refuses to spend it on people who will waste it. Jung described this selectivity as a form of psychological sovereignty. The empath has reclaimed the territory of their own psyche. They're no longer a commons that anyone can graze on. They're a walled garden, and the gate opens only for those who've demonstrated they won't trample what grows inside. This looks cold to people who benefited from the empath's old availability, but Jung recognized it as the first sign of genuine psychological health. The empath has stopped confusing self-sacrifice with love. The second thing the awakened empath becomes is difficult. They develop the capacity to say things that make people uncomfortable, to hold others accountable without softening the truth into something palatable, to sit in someone's displeasure without rushing to fix it. The old empath would have absorbed the tension, apologized, smoothed things over. The awakened empath lets the tension exist because they've learned that premature resolution is just another way of prioritizing someone else's comfort over their own integrity. Jung found this quality particularly fascinating because it emerged from the integration of what he called the aggressive shadow. Empaths typically repress all aggression, all fierceness, all capacity for confrontation. They've been taught that these qualities are antithetical to empathy. But Jung knew that a person who cannot access their aggression is not peaceful. They're domesticated. There's a difference between choosing gentleness and being incapable of anything else. The awakened empath can be gentle. They can also be fierce. And the choice between the two is conscious, deliberate, situation appropriate. The third transformation is perhaps the most disturbing to witness from the outside. The awakened empath develops what Jung called detached perception. They can see someone's pain with perfect clarity and choose not to engage with it, not because they've stopped feeling, but because they've learned to distinguish between perceiving suffering and being responsible for it. The old empath couldn't make this distinction. Someone's pain was automatically their assignment. The awakened empath perceives the same pain and recognizes it as belonging to the person experiencing it. They can hold compassion without holding responsibility. And this capacity horrifies people who were used to the empath carrying everything for everyone. Jung emphasized that detached perception wasn't the absence of empathy. It was empathy matured beyond the codependent stage. The empath still feels deeply. They still perceive what others miss. They still carry that extraordinary sensitivity that their childhood forged into them. But the feeling no longer hijacks their behavior. They can feel someone's desperation without being manipulated by it. They can sense someone's loneliness without making it their project to fix. They hold the full weight of what they perceive, and then they make a conscious choice about whether and how to respond. The fourth thing the awakened empath becomes is comfortable with being misunderstood. This might sound minor, but Jung considered it one of the most significant markers of genuine individuation. The old empath was terrified of being misunderstood. They would explain themselves endlessly, contort their communication, anticipate every possible misinterpretation, and try to prevent it. Their terror of being seen as selfish or cold or uncaring drove them to perform constant emotional availability, even when they were running on empty. The awakened empath lets people misunderstand them. They state their truth once. They don't chase understanding. They don't over-explain, justify, or defend. If someone interprets their boundaries as cruelty, the awakened empath can tolerate that interpretation without crumbling. Jung called this the withdrawal of projections, recognizing that you cannot control how others perceive you, and that the desperate need to manage everyone's perception of you is itself a form of bondage. This doesn't mean the awakened empath is indifferent to connection. They're not. They crave authentic relationship more deeply than they ever did before. But they've learned that authentic relationship is only possible with people who can see them clearly without the empath having to manage that seeing. People who can handle the real person, not just the performing one. And finding those people requires letting everyone else misunderstand you without trying to fix it. The fifth transformation Jung documented was the most paradoxical. The awakened empath becomes genuinely dangerous, not violent, not cruel, dangerous in the way that someone who sees clearly is always dangerous to systems built on denial. They can perceive manipulation the moment it begins. They can identify narcissistic patterns in a single conversation. They can feel when someone's words and energy don't match, and they trust that feeling absolutely without needing external confirmation. Jung observed that this perceptual accuracy, combined with the willingness to act on it, made awakened empaths threatening to unhealthy systems. Families built on secrets, organizations built on dysfunction, relationships built on control. The old empath was the perfect participant in these systems because they had absorbed the toxicity and keep everything running. The awakened empath sees the toxicity, names it if necessary, and removes themselves entirely if nothing changes. They've become the person the dysfunctional system cannot afford to have in the room, because their clarity exposes what everyone else has agreed not to see. But here's the cost Jung documented with unflinching honesty. The person the awakened empath becomes is lonely in ways that the old empath never was. The old empath was exhausted, depleted, used, but they were surrounded by people. They had a role, a purpose, an identity that others affirmed. The awakened empath has shed all of that. They've released the relationships that fed on their availability. They've abandoned the role that gave them identity. They've stopped performing the version of themselves that everyone loved. And what's left is a person who is psychologically whole, but socially smaller. Fewer people, fewer obligations, fewer connections. Each one genuine, but the quantity has dropped dramatically. Jung didn't pretend this was easy. He acknowledged that the transition period, the space between the death of the old empath and the stabilization of the new one, was one of the most painful psychological experiences a human could endure. You've released everything that was familiar. You haven't yet built what comes next. You're standing in an open field with nothing around you, and the freedom that everyone talks about in spiritual awakening feels less like liberation and more like exile. This is why Jung was so critical of the spiritual marketplace's version of empathic awakening. They sell it as a beautiful butterfly from cocoon experience. But Jung saw something rawer. He saw people who had to grieve the loss of their own identity, who had to mourn relationships that had been the architecture of their entire life, who had to sit with the devastating recognition that much of what they called love was actually just their trauma response, making them useful to people who couldn't be bothered to meet their own emotional needs. And yet, Jung found that the people who survived this transformation, who made it through the grief and the loneliness and the terrifying open space of having no one to rescue, emerged into something that looked like quiet power, not the dramatic visible power that the world recognizes, not charisma or influence or authority, something subtler and more resilient. The power of a person who knows exactly who they are, what they will accept, and what they won't. A person who has stopped negotiating with their own boundaries, who has stopped apologizing for their own existence, who has stopped contorting themselves into whatever shape would make everyone else comfortable. Jung called this the individuated empath. Someone who had completed the journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious perception, from compulsive absorption to deliberate choice, from performing empathy for survival to embodying empathy as strength. The individuated empath still feels everything. They still possess that extraordinary perceptual capacity that their childhood burned into their nervous system. But it serves them now instead of consuming them. It informs their choices instead of dictating their behavior. It connects them to people who deserve connection instead of chaining them to people who exploit it. The uncomfortable truth is that most people preferred the old empath, the available one, the one who would sit with your pain for hours without complaint, the one who would forgive anything because holding you accountable felt like cruelty, the one who would sacrifice their own well-being to maintain yours. That empath was convenient, useful, easy to be around because they demanded nothing while giving everything. The awakened empath demands reciprocity. They require honesty. They insist on being treated with the same care they offer others. And for the people who were used to the old dynamic, these requirements feel like betrayal. They'll say the empath has changed, has become selfish, has lost their compassion. Jung heard these accusations from the families and partners of his patients who were individuating, and he recognized them for what they were. Not descriptions of the empath's decline, but descriptions of other people's loss of access to an unregulated resource they'd been exploiting without realizing it. If you're in this transformation right now, if you're in the terrifying space between who you were and who you're becoming, Jung would want you to know something. The discomfort you feel isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's a sign that you're doing it at all. The loneliness isn't evidence of failure. It's the natural consequence of outgrowing a life that was built to contain someone who no longer exists. The grief is real, and it's appropriate because you are losing something. You're losing the person everyone was comfortable with, and that loss creates space for the person you actually are. What the awakened empath really becomes isn't prettier or more spiritual or more enlightened than who they were before. They become real, imperfect and boundaried and sometimes difficult and always honest. They become someone who can feel everything without being destroyed by it, who can perceive everything without being obligated to fix it, who can love deeply without losing themselves inside that love. Jung believed this transformation was one of the most significant a human consciousness could undergo, not because empaths are special or chosen, but because the journey from unconscious sensitivity to conscious wholeness requires confronting every comfortable lie you've ever told yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. It requires dying to an identity that felt like home, even though it was a prison. It requires standing in the empty space after everything falls away and discovering that you're still there, that you've always been there, underneath the performing, the absorbing, the rescuing, the accommodating. Underneath all of it, there was always a person, and that person is finally allowed to exist. That's what the awakened empath really becomes. Not a better version of the old self, a completely different relationship with the self, one where sensitivity is a tool rather than a wound, where perception is a choice rather than a compulsion, where love is an offering rather than an obligation. That's the uncomfortable truth. And if you're living it right now, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, you're further along than you think. If you haven't yet, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.